So today I want to talk about something that is affecting hundreds of millions of ordinary people in every major economy on earth right now, the cost of housing, and specifically the rental market. Because what I hear constantly from ordinary people, from young professionals, from families trying to plan their futures, from retirees trying to live on fixed incomes is the same question. When does rent come back down? When does housing become affordable again? When does the situation normalize? And I want to answer that question today with the same kind of structural economic analysis I apply to every major issue I cover. Not with politics, not with opinions, with the specific economic mechanisms that determine housing costs and with the data that tells you whether those mechanisms are temporary or permanent. And the answer that the data gives you is not comfortable, but it is honest. And you deserve honest analysis rather than reassuring narratives that leave you making decisions based on a future that is not coming. Let me begin with the most fundamental economic truth about housing markets. Housing costs are determined by the balance between supply and demand. When demand exceeds supply, prices and rents rise. When supply exceeds demand, they fall. This seems simple. But what the housing debate in most countries gets wrong is treating both sides of this equation as if they are flexible and responsive to market signals in the same way that the market for, say, consumer electronics or clothing is responsive. They are not. Housing supply is structurally constrained in ways that prevent the normal market correction mechanism from working. And housing demand is supported by structural forces that are not going to weaken. The result is a market that looks like a crisis from the outside, but is actually functioning exactly as the structural economics predict it should. And that is precisely why it is not going to correct itself. Let me walk you through each of the structural constraints that is preventing housing supply from catching up with demand. And then I want to explain the demand forces that are keeping pressure on the market, regardless of what interest rates do or what the economic cycle does. And if you are finding this analysis useful, please subscribe. I cover these structural economic realities every week because understanding the mechanisms behind the costs that consume the largest portion of your household budget is essential for planning your financial life intelligently. The first structural constraint on housing supply is construction cost inflation. Building a new housing unit, whether an apartment or a house, costs significantly more today in real terms than it did a decade ago. Material costs, lumber, steel, concrete, copper wiring, insulation have all risen sharply. Labor costs in the construction sector have risen as skilled tradespeople have become scarcer relative to demand. Regulatory compliance costs, the cost of meeting building codes, environmental requirements, accessibility standards, and planning requirements have grown substantially. The result is that the cost floor below which it is not economically viable to build has risen dramatically. A developer can only build housing at prices that cover their construction costs, their financing costs, and their required return on investment. When construction costs are high, the minimum viable sale or rental price is high. And when that minimum viable price is above what median income households can afford, the market does not build for median income households. It builds for higher income households, or it does not build at all. This is why new construction in most major cities is disproportionately high-end. It is not because developers prefer wealthy tenants. It is because the cost structure of modern construction makes building for lower income price points economically unviable without substantial subsidy. The second structural constraint is land scarcity and zoning restriction. In the cities and metropolitan areas where housing demand is strongest, land is physically scarce and legally constrained. Physical scarcity is obvious in island cities, peninsulas, and dense urban cores, where there is simply no more buildable land. Legal constraint is less obvious but equally powerful. Zoning regulations in most major American, European, and Australian cities restrict the density of development in ways that prevent the market from responding to demand by building more units on existing land. Single-family zoning, height restrictions, minimum parking requirements, setback requirements, and a host of other regulatory constraints all limit the number of units that can be built on any given piece of land. These restrictions were put in place over decades largely at the insistence of existing homeowners who benefit economically from restricting new supply because supply restriction keeps the value of their existing homes elevated. The political economy of zoning reform is deeply unfavorable to change because the people who benefit from current restrictions, existing homeowners, vote in much higher numbers than the people who would benefit from reform, renters, and young people who do not yet own property. This is not a problem that gets solved when the economic cycle turns or when interest rates change. It is a structural feature of the political economy of housing that requires sustained and politically costly reform to address, and that has resisted that reform in most jurisdictions for decades. Consider what meaningful zoning reform actually requires. It requires elected officials to tell their most reliably voting constituents, homeowners, that the policy which has helped their property values rise is going to be changed in ways that may moderate future price appreciation. No politician who depends on homeowner votes finds that an attractive position to campaign on. And so zoning reform happens slowly, partially, and against fierce resistance in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, while the supply constraint that it would alleviate continues to compound. Minneapolis, Auckland, and a handful of other cities have made meaningful progress on zoning reform. They are the exceptions in a landscape of jurisdictions where the political incentives continue to favor restriction over construction. The third structural constraint is the financialization of housing. Over the past 2 decades, housing has increasingly been treated not just as shelter, but as a financial asset, a vehicle for investment return. Institutional investors, real estate investment trusts, private equity firms, and large corporate landlords have entered the residential rental market at scale in ways that were historically uncommon. When institutional capital competes with individual households for the same housing stock, the institutional buyers have structural advantages that allow them to bid up prices beyond what individual households can sustain. They have lower financing costs. They have portfolio diversification that allows them to accept lower individual property returns. They have scale efficiencies in management that individual landlords cannot match. The result of this institutional entry into the residential housing market is a structural increase in the demand for housing as a financial asset that competes with and often displaces demand for housing as a primary residence. This is not a temporary phenomenon driven by a particular interest rate environment. It is a structural shift in the composition of housing market participants that has permanently altered the competitive dynamics of the rental and purchase markets. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. The structural analysis I am walking you through here explains why the housing situation you are experiencing feels permanent rather than temporary, because structurally, it is. The fourth factor is demographic demand. The argument that housing demand will weaken as populations age and household formation rates decline has some validity in the very long term in some markets. But in the near and medium term, the demographic picture for housing demand in most major economies is not weakening. Millennials, the largest generational cohort in most developed economies, are at the stage of their lives where household formation, marriage, and family formation are occurring at peak rates. This demographic wave is creating sustained demand for housing units at exactly the same time that supply constraints are preventing adequate new construction. Additionally, immigration into major metropolitan areas in the United States, Canada, Australia, and across Europe is adding substantial new demand for urban housing at rates that in many cities significantly exceed the rate of new construction. The demand side of the housing equation is being sustained by demographic forces that are not going to reverse in the near or medium term. The fifth and most misunderstood factor is the interest rate trap. When interest rates rose sharply starting in 2022, many analysts predicted that housing prices would fall significantly as the cost of mortgage financing increased and buyers were priced out of the purchase market. And in some markets, purchase prices did fall somewhat. but rents did not fall. In many markets, rents rose further. The reason is a mechanism that most housing market commentary misses. When mortgage rates are high, existing homeowners who locked in low-rate mortgages in the 2010s and early 2020s are reluctant to sell their homes and give up those favorable rates. They stay in their homes rather than trading up or moving, which means their homes do not come onto the market for sale or for rent. This lock-in effect reduces the supply of available housing units in the purchase market, which keeps purchase prices elevated despite higher financing costs. At the same time, higher mortgage rates price more potential buyers out of the purchase market, pushing them into the rental market where they increase demand and push rents higher. The interest rate mechanism that was supposed to cool the housing market is instead trapping supply and increasing rental demand simultaneously. It is creating exactly the opposite effect on affordability that the conventional analysis predicted. Here is what all 5 of these structural factors mean together. Construction costs create a high floor below which new housing cannot be built economically. Zoning and land constraints limit the supply response even when demand is high. Institutional capital has permanently elevated the competition for existing housing stock. Demographic demand is sustained at high levels, and the interest rate mechanism is simultaneously suppressing supply and boosting rental demand. There is no version of the current economic trajectory in which all 5 of these factors reverse simultaneously and produce a meaningful, sustained decline in housing costs. 1 or 2 of them might ease at the margin. Construction costs might stabilize. Zoning reform might happen slowly in some jurisdictions. But the convergence of all 5 structural pressures pointing in the same direction means that the baseline for housing costs has permanently shifted upward from where it was a decade ago. The uncomfortable truth that your rent will not return to where it was 5 years ago is not a prediction about what might happen in some uncertain future. It is a description of the structural economic reality that already exists and that the 5 mechanisms I have walked you through make durable rather than temporary. I want to be precise about what I am saying here. I am not saying rents will rise indefinitely at the rates seen in recent years. They may stabilize. In some markets, they may ease marginally. But ease marginally from an elevated structural level is very different from returning to the affordability levels of 5 or 10 years ago. The floor has moved up permanently because the structural inputs that determine housing costs, construction costs, land availability, institutional competition, demographic demand, and the interest rate lock-in effect have all moved in the same direction simultaneously. When multiple structural forces align in the same direction, the resulting shift in the baseline is durable, and making financial plans based on a correction that the structural data says is not coming is one of the most expensive mistakes that millions of households in the developed world are currently making. Understanding that it is not coming is the essential first step toward making the financial decisions that are appropriate for the world that actually exists. Subscribe for more analysis of structural economic forces explained clearly and plainly. And tell me in the comments, do you think housing affordability can improve in your city, or is the structural shift I described already irreversible? See you next time.